everyone. Welcome once more to our podcast. I'm here today with Minta. We are talking before. I asked her, how do you define yourself? And she said, I'm a creative technologist, which is usually like a weird combination, right? Like, because usually people are very creative, it's more artistic, sometimes are a little bit allergic to technology. And you are like a rare breed, right? Like,
Yeah, I would say I'm a little bit like the AI itself in that I like patterns. I like seeing and like hunting down the patterns and formulas and things. But I have always had a very creative side. So I studied theater in college as a director, which I think also really makes me very technology adjacent, but still embracing the creativity.
okay, so we have, there is today like plenty of people that are a little bit afraid of AI, okay? And maybe some people that, like you, are creative, but they don't know how to get into the game, so to say. So can you explain us a little bit how did it all started? How did you got into AI?
So for me, I stumbled into it a bit, but it was at a time where it wasn't so hyped. It was before this big wave. And I can understand why someone who maybe doesn't feel very technologically empowered, but feels very creative, very maybe traditionally artistic, could be maybe frightened or uncomfortable. The thing to remember is that there's a huge amount of opportunity to take whatever your unique skill set is, the thing that makes you particularly special or stand out in your art or your design or your creativity, and amplify it. And so what I use AI for can be quite technical sometimes, but I don't have a background in code. It took a lot of time for me to get there. And there are a lot of people who have a background in code who should have gotten there a little faster maybe than I did. But the reason I've been able to do what I do to fine-tune models, which is what I do most, is because my unique skill set of being able to understand patterns, understand design and style, and particularly be able to look at two images and decide if they're in the right style or not, if they're the same style, it actually created advantages that other people who were doing the same things and had much more technological experience couldn't do because they didn't have my experience.
Okay, but speaking about myself, okay, when I see a trajectory like this, sometimes to me it's difficult to connect the dots. It's like,
Right.
yeah, you have a person like yourself, okay, who has maybe a training in more like traditional creative tasks, and now is like a well-known AI artist, so to say, with a with a hand in technology, a hand in creativity, and I understand what you say. In a way, it's like you need to amplify what is unique about you and what you have to say. But I think as an artist, they will ask themselves, okay, but okay, how exactly do I get there? I mean, I don't even know how to take the first step. And at least to me, something that is very useful is to listen how other people went into that path.
Sure.
So can you take us a little bit back and explain like how did you got into this at all, and how did you took like your first steps?
Yeah, so it was a very roundabout path for me. And I got very interested in what was happening in AI before that big explosion, which was Stable Diffusion. So before Stable Diffusion, it was a lot of really sort of difficult or strange looking open source models, and then there were a few companies that were creating these models, like creating these platforms for the models, like Midjourney, I think Starry AI at that time. There's a few different ones, and I started using Midjourney because I just found it interesting and fun, and I as I was using it, I realized, oh, I could create something with this. So it was really innocent. It was just like, I wasn't thinking of building a career on it. I was just like, I want to create a project with this one thing. And so I did. I made this tarot deck using really early images from Midjourney before it looked like pretty. They were all very strange. But then Stable Diffusion came out and everything blew up. So it was really at that point about not just my skill, but also my proximity. I was already in this space. I was talking to people, and I was paying attention. And that allowed me to realize that there were people who were taking this Stable Diffusion model, and they were fine-tuning it. They were bringing in their own images to customize it. Mm-hmm. And I saw those results looked better. So I wanted to make something better. I was like, if they can do it, I want to be able to do it. And so myself and my business partner, we've been longtime collaborators. We bought a 3090 and we set it up locally. And I got a few friends who were coders to give me some advice. But basically, I just kind of kept trying to make this open source code that I found in the space work. And I failed a few times. But this is where being an artist had an advantage. I knew the difference between failure and success visually, and I could also see the small changes. So and I still see this, whereas some people will think, oh, this has failed, and then they'll train it again, and they'll be like, this doesn't look like the style either. Someone who's trained at looking at styles will be able to tell which is closer. Mm-hmm. And that is important because that's going to get you much, much closer. So for me, it was all about just wanting to create something better and having that drive and kind of just muscling through it and trying to get through my own confidence issues around code and all of that. I'm still not a good coder, but I learned enough to do what I needed to do.
Okay, so for those who don't know, by the way, we try to 3090 is a GPU from NVIDIA. It was the best one that there was before the 4090, that is the state of the art for gaming. And it's a relatively expensive GPU. So I find it super interesting because what you say is, if I can make a summary a little bit, is you started moving, you got into the game, you started looking at what was possible, initially just playing and having fun and looking what was available, and then looking at what others were doing and trying to replicate it little by little and getting better at that. And then it was key that you have an eye that told you if what you were getting was right or wrong, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Did you ever have to put your GPU in the fridge? Or?
No, luckily no. If you'll remember, it all came out during September of 2022, and I lived in Portland, Maine.
I remember it very, very well.
And it was the nice thing about Portland, Maine is it gets really cold in the winter. So I don't live in Portland anymore, but at that time, I just had to turn down the heat. So yeah, and it did get hot in that apartment.
Okay, and how did you start to explore all the wide variety of images that you can create? I mean, how do you work about that? Do you start using drawings that you already had and training the models on your drawings, or how do you do it?
So I've done that, and I've trained on synthetic data, so images created by AI. And I think it's important to point out, first and foremost, the model trains differently on the two. Synthetic images tend to train faster, they tend to be really, really quick, and it's a little easier to hit the result that you want. Whereas images that someone has drawn by hand or photos, etc., takes longer to train, and sometimes it's incredibly hard to get it perfect. And I guess, like a lot of artists and creatives, I'm kind of a perfectionist. So I think that's what really drove me to try lots of different styles, because I would see examples in the space, and they would say, this is the best version of this, or these two images are in the same style, it's amazing. And I'd be like, those are not the same style, those are different styles. And so I wanted to solve the problem. because I wasn't seeing someone else do it at that time, and particularly for illustration, because illustration has been consistently the hardest for people to get good results with. Especially hand-drawn illustration can be so nuanced, and the bias that these models have often determines how quickly or how difficult the training will be. And the bias for illustration is often very generic, so it takes a lot longer to get things just right.
Okay, like as all the artists know, in the different visual styles that you can use, some of them are very subtle, right? In some of them, a great part of the magic happens in the details, and sometimes AI is not good at capturing that.
Yeah.
Okay, and you have artists that play with movement, for example, and then on AI what you get are blurry images instead of images that depict movement.
Yeah.
Okay, how much over time? What has been the improvement that you've seen? How good do you think AI is? And do you think that it's actually getting to capture the essence of the images? Are we getting there? Are we far away?
We're getting very close. I think it's starting to become more and more a challenge of skill in terms of like customization. I think in my experience, I have had with the most current models, like Flux Dev is a very current model from Black Forest Labs. I've been able to jump from like maybe 75 to 85% consistency to much closer to like 95% consistency. And it ranges depending on the style, and it also ranges depending on the data set. So oftentimes, if I'm working with a client and training for them, the data set will just be too small. The images used for training will be 5 and they really need to be 15, that type of thing. But with a perfect data set, I would say that it's 95 to 98% consistency for most styles. I think photorealism still has a little bit of an uncanny valley effect sometimes, and benefits from post-processing if you're in like an advertising space. With illustration, I've definitely gotten illustrated styles with really good training data sets to 95 to 98%. I never like to say 100%, but it's gotten pretty close in some cases.
And how close do you think we are to making this process of fine-tuning to a particular style like almost completely automated, to have a fixed set of rules that if the customer follows them, they will be able to really create their own style? Because if we want this to be like completely democratic and open to everyone, eventually people will need to be able to say, this is the style that I want, and many people will have their own style.
Yeah.
How close do you think we are to that?
Well, I think that is a question that deserves a nuanced answer, because I think it depends on who's using it. I think for most people right now, for like the average user, you can probably find a style. You can craft things in such a way that you can absolutely get your consistent style. And I would say that's like 80% of people. Probably if they use some of the tools that are set up, the free pick tool is a really cool one. They can definitely hit that level of consistency with style. Now, when we get more technical, that's where we need to start asking questions. Like, what is the use case? How specific does this need to be? What type of outputs am I looking for? So, for example, I'm working on a animated short right now, and we know we're going to use some traditional animation in it, but all of the AI, all of the like backgrounds and props, we're going to feed in my illustrations and then generate these different pieces to save time and create a really nuanced and like streamlined system. That takes a lot of curating on my end, because as an artist and someone who has like a very specific vision for how this needs to be executed, I have no willingness to compromise. But in my experience, that isn't most people. That's usually someone who's making a very like complete project with a lot of moving parts. But for like an ad campaign, that type of thing, I think it's there. Like it really depends on the medium that you're putting it into.
Okay, and you also worked for Scenario, which
Yeah.
is a French startup. They also have a leg in the US. So, and Scenario, I think they have been leading in terms of character consistency and creating assets for video games, where obviously to maintain the same character in multiple situations is very important. So you have seen like first, you have been at the first row witnessing how the industry has been improving in something as important as character consistency. And ourselves at FreePic, we are adding more tools that help users have more control over what they generate. Can you tell us a little bit about the story? Like starting from stability models, when we started from text to image, up until today, like what has been like the main inflection points that you have seen that have given people more control and more usefulness of the generated images, and what do you foresee in the future?
Yeah, so I have seen that SDXL was a huge jump forward. So we have a few different models from Stability for those who aren't aware. We had the first model, which was SD1, and it went through a few different iterations up to SD 1.5. And then we had this little blip of a model called SD2 that I actually loved. I used it a lot, but it never got the same like mainstream traction because of how text worked in it. I think it was actually nice to fine tune. I liked it for that, but for like regular prompting, it just people weren't happy with it. SDXL, the team used a lot more like different nuanced approaches to training the model itself, and you could see that in its understanding and adherence to consistent concepts. I think that was a huge jump forward, and that's where I saw some really compelling character consistency. I found that it did still need things like IP adapter, which helps to guide with image references, as well as using things like ControlNet, which guides by creating different maps that the model uses. So that was a big jump forward, but I think the biggest jump has had to be Flux, and specifically Flux Dev, which came from the Black Forest Labs. And I find that for me, I'm actually, like I was saying for this short, I'm drawing this character data set by hand and using it to train, and that is probably the hardest character consistency to get right, because the bias of the model tends to try to generalize. It will add a lot of details. It will make things very weird. But with Flux, I've gotten it to a point, and it's not quite at a scalable level yet. I can't say like this setting will work for every single person, but I have been able to get it to a point where it works consistently enough that the character looks like that character in every iteration. It's not changing the clothing necessarily. It's not changing like the structure of the hair. And the biggest jump forward for character consistency with Flux is that when you train a character model, Flux understands things like character turnarounds, animation sheets, expression sheets. And so you can have this character trained and prompt it to do an animation expression sheet that shows 10 different expressions, and it will do that, and it will be that same character that you trained. That is a huge step forward that none of the models could do before. They didn't understand the concept of these different ways of presenting art in the same way, and I find that to be like a huge step forward. It allows, although I would say we're not at the point where you can fully animate a film with AI yet, it does allow someone to like create everything they need to just build a scene from. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Listen, like a little data point from ourselves. So what we see from customer support, okay, we get people that were, of course, they complain when something doesn't work, and initially I'd say that for a couple of months, when we integrated Stable Diffusion XL, SDXL, we got like very happy comments on it. It's like, wow, it's great, because it was a huge step forward from compared to what we had before. But then, after a couple of months, the comments started to switch. It came from, wow, this is great, came down to, wait a second, I asked for a green scarf and a blue bonnet, and it switched out the colors. It's like, come on, it's still drawing a scarf. So you see how people started to raise the bar,
Yeah.
right? We are still like after integrating Flux and then our own Mystic, people are still happy. I don't know for how long, but actually, if you think about it, like without having any empathy for the computer, it's actually still getting it wrong when you have a long description.
Yeah.
Okay, so now it can get like up to 2 or 3 objects right in the right position, the right color, which is amazing compared to 6 months ago. But you go over that more than 3, and it starts, blending things over. It doesn't understand it very well. Okay.
Yeah.
What do you think that we need to get to a point where we can actually create like a film with AI?
That's a tough question to answer, and that's a tough one, because there are so many moving parts, like literally and figuratively. There are a lot of moving parts in a film, and I think about this a lot, especially for animation. Let's take an anime as an example. There is a formula for how anime is meant to look, and that formula changes depending on what you're creating, but generally there are particular types of shots that help to amplify the storytelling. I struggle to imagine a program that can figure out those pieces without very specific human input. And it begs the question for me of, is it a matter of the technology getting to a point where it can generate this, or does our society and our creative systems, do they need to have the time to catch up in how they've adapted? Because I think actually, if you were to ask me, I would say you can create a movie with AI today if you understand what you want to create. There's plenty of things that will make it possible for you to make a movie in a minuscule budget, which is unheard of in filmmaking. But the challenge, I think, is that we still have a lot of resistance from the mainstream people behind filmmaking. They're adopting it, but it's confusing and it's different and it's a new pipeline. And then we also have the technology has made these insane advances in such a short period of time, but it's not doing everything perfectly right now. And the way my brain works, that means that we're actually there, but things haven't clicked yet. But to answer your question more directly, I'm not sure we will get to a point where we can generate a full film. Maybe we will. I know Ben Affleck thinks we will. But I think that we are going to get to a point where independent creatives can make things that they never would have been able to make before without sacrificing quality. And I have talked to so many individual creatives who had to sacrifice quality in the past and have said point blank to me, if AI had existed when I tried to make my game, my animation, etc., I probably wouldn't have had to sacrifice the quality.
Yeah. Okay, isn't it fascinating that so often when you want to do something artistic, it actually gets down to do that, you need to solve like AGI. You need to create something that is really smart. I was listening the other day to an interview to Ilya, who made the example that tried to explain why by creating an LLM that is like guessing the next word in a sentence, you actually need to develop intelligence. So he made the example, imagine that you have a novel, and it's like there's a crime and somebody killed somebody, and there's a detective, and you get to the end of the novel, and the detective says, and the murderer is, complete the sentence. So actually, to complete that sentence, you need to understand the book, to understand and be really smart. And here you're saying that to make a film, certain shots, you need to understand what you're saying to take the shot. And same thing happens with text to voice, right? Like to read something, you need to understand what you're saying to know where you need to put the emphasis in the sentence. And that's like the difficult part of text to speech.
That's the difficult part with real people. Like I've directed people before. They don't always know how to say the line correctly on the first go. So I think we have really high expectations for AI that I don't think is unfounded. I think it's great to have these high expectations, but I think sometimes they're higher than the expectations we have for actual human intelligence, which is interesting to me. I find it fascinating because you would think we would be just trying to match human intelligence, but we almost put AI on this pedestal of like, this should be better than us. And that is a really like human-centric viewpoint that I find very interesting.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you another question. I read an article by Thomas Puello. Thomas Puello is, to me, like a fantastic writer. He writes like very clearly on certain subjects, and he wrote about AI and the impact of AI on society. And he was drawing some parallels with the past. He said, okay, like often in the past when we got like a huge increase in productivity, sometimes it actually affects the jobs. Okay, and he makes the example that people working in farming in the US, it went down from, but it was a huge figure, like plus 60-70% of the population working in farming at the beginning of the century, down to less than 2% of them working in farming today. Okay, so sometimes increases in productivity really take jobs out of the market, but sometimes they don't. Okay, you get increases in productivity like computers. Okay, computers drive an increase in productivity. People working in finance, and now they're doing like more things than before. Okay. And he tries to understand, okay, are we in a case where AI is gonna giving us, it's clearly giving us like an increase in productivity, and he writes about, is there in society a latent demand for art that is so big, because it used to be very expensive, okay, that people could not get artists to do what they needed. Like if you want a book for your kids that shows your kids, you need an illustrator to do that. You needed an illustrator to do that. And therefore, nobody was doing that, or very few people were doing that, or only on very, very special occasions, okay? But now you can do it. Or you can ask somebody to do it for you, probably in just a few hours, okay? So do you think that we have in society like enough latent demand for artists so that will absorb the increase in productivity, and actually we'll have the same artists that are working today, working with tools, being more productive, or even more artists, because usually what happens is that you get more people because as the product becomes cheaper, the demand increases. Sometimes it increases even more, than the production. So what's your take on that? What do you think?
I think that there will very likely be, and this is going to be the hard part, very likely be less jobs that are explicitly stated as, technical artists. I think that is a realistic, but I think it's going to be true in most fields. I think a lot of those very rote technical jobs will likely decrease in how often people are looking for them, or they'll expect an increase in efficiency. I think that is going to be a very natural result. We've seen that result in other technological revolutions.
Can you define rote technical?
Yeah,
give us an example.
So I'll use a previous technical revolution to sort of.
Yeah.
So thinking of like the loom, right? When people used to hand weave everything, and then they created, through the Industrial Revolution, these automated looming technologies, et cetera, that replaced an artisan. And suddenly, it was only very specific situations where someone with that skill set was wanted. Their art became artisanship, so they could definitely get a higher price for it, but it was also kind of relegated to only being
very niche.
Niche. It was only affordable by the richest people. That still exists technically. Like there's still, people in this world who spend tens of thousands of dollars on a dress that has been sewn to fit their body in an atelier.
Yeah.
Like that exists. And so to that point, the technical artists who have these really, really fine and refined skills are not going to go away. But I think that the jobs for average people who have that skill set probably will decrease. What I think will increase will be the opportunity for artists who are really inspired, who are really look to become an artist because that's all they want to do, to create things from scratch on a minuscule budget. And I think that in that respect, I do think that there's I think people consume media, content, everything, absolutely. I think Netflix is the perfect example of that. People binge content. And I will also say that we already separate content based on how well crafted it is. I'm sure you've heard any number of people talk about reality TV. And not to say anything bad about it, that actually has a whole craft around it, but it's not considered an art, right? And people, in fact, put it in its own category that's lower brow than perhaps Mad Men, right? This is really well written. So human beings already categorize things. We know we put things in boxes. That will continue to happen. Opportunity to create will be less and less dependent on a studio being willing to produce your content. Suddenly, if you have saved a little, or if you want to do it entirely by yourself and spend a year working in a restaurant and spending your evenings just making this film, you can do that now. That's realistic. That's not outside of the realm of belief. It might take you longer, but previously it would have been just fully unrealistic. And so I think we have an opportunity as artists to create more of our own things. What I will say is, if you're getting into art just to do the technical piece, that is going to be a much more competitive field. It will continue to get more competitive, and it'll be like being the top chair, seat in an orchestra. You will need to be the best of the best to sort of get through, and it probably will depend also on your network.
Aligned with that, with what you mentioned about artists being still able to create and to create more. I remember talking there's a lady working at FreePik, and for the record, at FreePik, when this AI revolution started, me myself, I was scared of the consequences of that. I didn't knew how to deal with it, and we have many people at the company that were very much afraid of what was going to happen. We have many artists at FreePik. I remember talking to one of them, Melissa, and she was telling me, I studied photography, and for so many years I learned about lights and about how to create a scene, how to tell something, how to send a message with taking a photo, but it was too expensive to me. Yeah, it was too expensive for me. I didn't have the lights, I didn't have all the equipment that was needed to do that, and now I can do that.
Yeah.
So she started spending countless hours at home initially and just creating images, and she became super good AI artist.
Well, I think you hit on a really good point there in that story, in that basically, rather than thinking of your education around art as an artist being focused on the technical aspect, like being able to take the perfect photo or draw the perfect thing, you should be reframing that to understanding the possibility and how that impacts people. When I went to school for theater directing, that was a large part of our education, was simply, okay, you have these two people standing on this part of the stage. That actually, the stage is very closed up right now. It's not interesting for the audience. Put this person here and suddenly it opens the stage. And those are the types of things that if someone doesn't say it, it's not necessarily going to occur to you, and it might off chance get generated by an AI model, but it might not, and you might not want it to. You might want to be the one to make that decision. It depends on who you are. So I think that especially artists who have spent a lot of time learning and educating, whether that's going to school or self-educating, thinking more about how that education informs how they perceive art and what they value in art, those are going to be important pieces to a future with AI.
Right. Like, sometimes I remember I've seen like very good photographers and some people telling them, wow, I mean, your camera takes very good photos. And I always said, like, yeah, your mouth says very nice things. It's obviously not about taking the photo. It's not about pressing the button. It's to have an idea what you want, in your lens, what kind of image are you looking for. And, I mentioned like a couple of times, I don't know if I'm making it up, but, part of it is here we are in Malaga. So in Malaga, like Picasso is one of the greatest painters in history. It's where he was born. And when Picasso started, he went through multiple styles, and one of them obviously was Cubism, okay? And at the time when he did that, something that was shocking to people is that he got inspired by African art, primitive African art. So you got the totems that were very flattish. So it's like he used that as inspiration to get a 3D image and flatten it in the canvas, and show like all sides at the same time, kind of. And for many people, that I think it happened in 1918, and Europe at that time was very racist. You got the beginnings of Nazism and all of that. And for many people to have like the greatest artists in Europe get inspired to get to the next level, to get inspired by primitive African art, it was kind of an insult. Okay, yeah. So to me, he was kind of sending a message. Okay, and me personally, I'm usually not touched by something that comes right out of the model with a simple prompt. I'm touched when the person that is typing something or creating something, when they're trying to say something, when they have a particular style, when they're trying to send a message. Okay, just like I get very bored when I read some, boilerplate from ChatGPT. I mean, I don't care if ChatGPT helps you say something, but they want to hear humans saying something. And I think that's going to be common between text, images, or anything. We are moved by others talking and.
Absolutely. And there's been a lot of interesting research. I think it happened around like the early 2000s, late 90s, by a neurologist, V.S. Ramachandran. And he really focused on why humans interact with art, where our interest in art comes from. And it comes from a lot of different places. But the ones that are like the deepest are pattern recognition. Because we rely on our ability to recognize patterns to stay safe. I think it was a quote in the series Fargo where like the very evil character was like, why do humans see the most shades of green of any animal? It's because we need to see the predator in the the greenery, basically. So we rely on it for that reason, but we also need to reflect on why human beings feel emotion. Like people have emotional experiences with art, and that's separate from the predator piece. We're not always afraid when we look at paintings, right? You don't look at a Picasso and suddenly get scared. And that has to do with how empathy works in a human being. When we see someone else doing something, our brain responds as though we were doing it. And although art abstracts that, and it makes it a little less clear, a little more generic, generalized, or even just like further from what we can put into words, it still allows us to experience that because of the pattern recognition. So for human beings, the combination of being able to create concepts out of patterns and relate to how someone else is experiencing something and have a feeling, that is what makes something a really profound experience as the viewer. And so it makes perfect sense that we value a human being being attached to that, because it fits into the puzzle that is why we even care about art.
And of course, like computers, AI, something that they are really good at is taking existing patterns, understanding those patterns. Sometimes, like, they are really good at it, eerily good. And I think that sometimes they also create something new using those patterns. It's not just interpolating like many people say.
I think you're right. I mean, they're using probability to put together new combinations, and I think those can be really unique. I think we can find unexpected combinations, and I think that's why people like using AI. I mean, I'm sure people like using AI because of its productivity or how it just generally functions, but I'm not afraid to admit that I just like using AI because it makes me smile sometimes, and I think that sometimes it creates things that are like cool or interesting or funny, and for me that's okay. Like, and I think that as a culture we're still kind of like wrestling with where this fits in our humanness, and I think people feel threatened by that, but for me, at the end of the day, it's just something I like.
I remember another one of our AI artists who told me that, at least at the beginning when we started, that he liked to use AI, but the quality of the image was very bad compared to what he could do. And it was, no, but I love to use it to get ideas. Not so much, I mean, then the image I can do it myself, but to get ideas into what to work, which is very counterintuitive.
Yeah, I've definitely had that experience myself where I've like created a model styled on my particular art style, and I needed like a chair, right, for this thing I was making. So I was like, generate a chair, and I generated like 30 chairs, and I just kept generating because it was so interesting. I was like, oh, that's also a chair. That's also a chair. And like, I didn't know which chair I wanted. They were so interesting and fun. It's a little like kind of looking for the perfect chair for your house at that point, which for me is fun.
Minta, anything else that you want to comment or even ask?
Well, you've asked me a lot about what my opinion of the future of AI is. I'm curious, what's your big thing that you're like, I think this is going to happen next or should happen next?
Okay, so first of all, I think that we are very bad at predicting the future. So what I see is that we are reasonably good at just extrapolating, but then when the extrapolation breaks, it's not that great. I use often the example of imagine asking a monk in the 15th century, how do you think the mechanical printer is going to affect? It's going to affect the world. So obviously they can extrapolate. Okay, they can see, oh, we are going to get more books. It's going to be cheaper. Like at the time to get a Bible, a good Bible, it could cost like a little house. It was very expensive. So that was going to make books much cheaper. To predict something like a newspaper, it's very difficult. Okay, or imagine like the first calculators. An example that is closer to us so what do you think is going to happen with calculators? You would think, okay, accountants, they're going to have, they're going to be much more efficient. But now you will not predict 3D video games, and certainly not LLMs making lots of multiplications, on the background to generate text. It's very difficult to get there. So what we see is AI image generators in the short term, and in general, like anything touching any media, sound, probably 3D in the future, is just continuously getting better. And we don't see yet any limit to that. Some people are commenting maybe there's a limit on the number of images that we are training. But I think we will overcome that. There is so much interest into getting those models better and better that will generate synthetic data. We're just scratching, what can be done. So I think those models will get better. I think we still don't realize how bad they are at following instructions, because we are so amazed that they kind of follow what you say, that you are very generous with the idea that they are actually paying attention. So what we can see like short term coming is, I think in the next couple of years, so models that you can give them an image, you can ask anything about the image, and then will actually understand you and follow what you do. Longer term, just putting together existing pieces, you can see how they can help anyone tell a story. So you want like a kind of professional storyboard about an idea, you would probably be able to customize the storyboard, and you could, create some films based on that. I think it can affect the ad industry. So for example, today only like top-notch brands can do TV ads or TV quality ads. And on advertising in text and images, we got down to little shops being able to advertise, especially on Google, on Facebook, do local advertisements. So I think we will get to a point where little brands will be able to create like TV grade ads, and use them to advertise what they do. Longer term, honestly, I don't know. Like some people think that it's gonna completely disrupt all media. It's gonna be like its own media on its own. Like it will allow us to navigate on 3D we'll be like creating worlds with words in a way, and navigating those worlds, and maybe disrupting the whole video game industry. I think it will create new industries in a way.
Yeah.
To me, video game and films are the only industry that makes so much money that can afford art today.
Yeah.
So I think this is going to become like much cheaper. Indie games will increase in quality, but I think there's going to be many more use cases that today we are not even thinking about that will just be possible.
I hope, if nothing else, that right now we're in a stagnancy with some of these creative spaces like games and the movie industry, and these big production studios only bet on sure deals, and I think we'll finally get a chance where that breaks through again, and so many people are creating so much and flooding the space that we're forced to reconsider what people actually like.
No, I think about it. I think this will do to kind of art of visual content. It will do the same thing that social networks did to traditional media.
Yeah.
For good and bad. Okay, it is like disrupt the fact that only a few players were able to communicate because it was so expensive to do it and so rare.
I mean, we had Martha Stewart as like the only influencer in the 90s, and now we have more influencers than you could bother to count, and they're all making livings on this. So.
Okay, so I think we are out of time. Minta, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much.
And thank you so much, and thank you for collaborating with us, and thank you for all the work that you have done in general in your career with AI and outside of AI. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a great pleasure to be here.
Thank you.